Dr. Wallach, thanks for joining me.
Glad to be here.
Why don't we start off with your background? Where'd you start off? What have you done so far in your career, and where are you now?
I'm someone who's been interested in American government most of my life. After I finished college, I got my first job working at the American Enterprise Institute as a research assistant, thinking about federalism issues. And after that, I went and got my PhD from Princeton in American politics and thinking pretty broadly about the American policymaking process, but especially sort of some administrative law topics, sort of questions about how statutes work in terms of directing the executive branch to do things. That's what I wrote my dissertation about. And after that, I went back to think tank land in DC. So I, in 2012, went to the Brookings Institution. I was there for about 5.5 years. After that, I was at the R Street Institute working on Congress stuff there for a while, and then since fall of 2020, I've been back at the American Enterprise Institute as a scholar, and so I'm somebody who thinks about the American separation of powers and sort of how our constitutional structures work, how that translates into real life policymaking, and not just about sort of how well policies work, but also how well the government is working at achieving legitimacy on a really broad scale. So the first book I wrote was in 2015. I wrote a book called To the Edge: Legality, Legitimacy, and the Responses to the 2008 Financial Crisis. So that was sort of on my mind for obvious reasons, but it really got me thinking about what it was about the response to the financial crisis that the American people found so disappointing. And over time, I've sort of come to focus on Congress as sort of, in some ways, the sort of wobbly leg of the stool of the American separation of powers, the one that needs the most attention, the one that we really need to be the strongest, but that has been problematic in recent years for various reasons we'll get into.
So what drew you to this area in the first place? Was it something that you always had since you were young, or was it something spur you on later on in your academic career?
I've always been interested in sort of the law, but I decided I didn't want to be a lawyer. That's sort of part of the defining feature of my career, is that I end up studying a lot of topics that lawyers think about, administrative law and statutory interpretation, but I come at them from a more political angle. Sort of lawyers are engaged in a sort of formalistic enterprise often, and I think of myself as thinking a little bit more broadly about sort of what makes all this stuff work in the end, and that isn't always formalistic stuff.
So your most recent book is just out, called Why Congress. Can you talk to us about what exactly the book's about? What questions did you ask and what did you find?
Thanks. Yeah. So Why Congress, Oxford University Press, coming out in May 2023. And I'm excited about this book. It does a lot of things, so I have to sort of take it in parts. So one thing is it just tries to sort of address that overarching question. Why Congress? What is this institution supposed to do in our constitutional system? I think that an awful lot of people who are engaged sort of in politics or part of the chattering classes about politics, they can come up with the sort of 8th grade civics reasons for why we have a legislature. Those come to mind, all right. But people really don't have a lot of conviction. They really are sick of Congress in many ways. They think it's a nuisance. And they really, if you really press them, give me a rendition with feeling of why we should actually bother with this institution, they're really not doing so great. And that even includes a lot of people who are over on Capitol Hill, I find. I think so much of our public discourse today is oriented around how can we influence what's going on in the White House, or how can we read the tea leaves of the Supreme Court. And so Why Congress is meant to draw people's focus back to Congress and say, hey, American society is very diverse, very factious, and if we have any chance of holding the country together and working out big problems that divide us in a way that we can all accept, find mutual accommodations, that has to happen in Congress. it really can't happen anywhere else in our government. So just laying out that theoretical case for Congress in a forceful way, I think, is part of the objective of the book. But then the book also ended up being a lot more about congressional organization than I realized it would when I set out to write it. Because when you think about what's going to make Congress work, you're going to have to think about its internal organization, how it's actually dividing up power between the legislators that are part of the body. And so a lot of it is about sort of where's the actual impetus for action in Congress. And the answer today in recent years has largely been that it's been centralized in the leadership offices of each respective chamber. But I think it's very important to understand, if you're willing to zoom out historically, more than the last quarter century, you realize it's not always been like that at all. And so part of the sort of historical core of the book is to track sort of the last half century of congressional evolution, because when you go back to the late 60s and 70s and think about what was going on in Congress then, the problems look completely different. They had started out with these imperious committee chairmen who really ran the place. Surging liberals were not happy with that arrangement and managed to disrupt it. What they got instead was this wildly decentralized body, subcommittee government in the 1970s, a huge expansion of staff, a body very much in flux, not so capable of focusing in many ways, and sort of dealing with that set of problems. The radically decentralized Congress eventually brought us to the modern era of strong centralized leadership. But you sort of have to appreciate that whole arc to understand why we got where we are today, and also I think to have a sense that we don't have to permanently be this way. We could, in fact, move to a different style of organization that this institution has had in the past. So that's another one of the main objectives of the book. And then the last part of the book is thinking about the futures of Congress and where we can go from here. That's very important for thinking about the whole congressional reform project, because I think that I have the sense that a lot of congressional reformers are actually quite split about what they want out of Congress. There's some people who are congressional reformers and really want to re-energize the body and make it the focus of the American policymaking process. I think there's another set of reformers who mostly believe that Congress is a pain in the butt, and their idea of reform is to figure out ways of making it less of a nuisance, basically get itself out of the way, so that majorities in America can work their will more effectively and more easily. That's very much not my vision. I'm very much committed to the idea of revitalizing Congress as a place where different factions are able to mix it up with each other and really making it the center of American government. So that's sort of the book. The book is doing a lot of different things, but those are sort of the broad outlines.
And so when you talk about, the notion of centralization, decentralization, right, and it's kind of back and forth a few times, did you have specific questions about that or conclusions about it? Clearly, it sounds to me like you think that centralization or over-centralization is not a positive for the Congress, but it also sounds like you're saying that when it was highly decentralized in the subcommittee, when subcommittees were dominating the landscape, that also wasn't the ideal scenario. So did you come to some kind of conclusion about where it needs to be in terms of centralization versus decentralization? And does technology play into this at all? Because in the old days, you can imagine if there are no computers, and it's 200 years ago, it would be hard to do a lot of things in a decentralized manner. Whereas today, you can do more things in a decentralized manner using technology, in some form. You have all the bills available to everyone at all the time, and that sort of thing. So I'm curious about what you've thought through in that regard.
Well, let me come back to the technology piece, because that's interesting to me, but not sort of a central focus of the book. But so the central metaphor that I use to think about this centralization versus decentralization idea in the book is a pendulum. So a pendulum of organization in Congress, where you kind of, over the very long term, see a tendency to swing from one extreme to the other. So when we go back to the early 20th century, that was a time of extreme centralization. These very, very, very powerful Republican speakers of the House who have the office buildings. Joseph Gurney Cannon, Boss Cannon, is the dominant figure of the first decade of the 20th century. But you see him overthrown ultimately in 1910, and his own progressives within the Republican Party sort of figure out ways of dislodging him from his dominance of the Rules Committee, and that's what leads to the sort of sacrosanct seniority principle for committee chairs, which makes them so powerful by the middle of the 20th century. So that's sort of one swing of the pendulum, but it sort of keeps on swinging toward really this decentralized power. I think sort of mid-seniority members had their reasons to want that, and they sort of push things all the way to a place of real chaos, almost, or cacophony is the word that I use. And if you have just too many voices doing too many things at once, you lose the ability to really get it all together and come together and make things happen. So you have sort of perils on either side of the extreme swings of the pendulum. On the centralization side, you sort of end up with stagnancy and a sense of rigid orthodoxy. And the problem with that is it tends not to be very good at accommodating sort of new things that come around in the world. It's not so good at adjusting fast enough to new challenges. And so you have that broken up, and it sort of sends things swinging, possibly all the way to the other extreme, where at that point you get very much decentralized authority, and that sort of opens the door for organized interests to come in and kind of manipulate things often. If things are too chaotic, they're going to be the ones that figure out how to make hay in that environment. So my idea is certainly that somewhere in the middle of the swing is sort of the sweet spot where you can kind of have many power centers, enough power centers to make things fluid and negotiations interesting and fruitful, but not such a fragmentation of power that you can't get anything done. But the pendulum metaphor does suggest sort of it's hard to stop in the middle at any one time. And it also sort of suggests I can't just say centralization bad or decentralization bad in general. It kind of depends on where we are. But my sense is that we really have been all the way at one end of the swing of the pendulum in recent decades, that, in the speakership, especially since Gingrich, but so that means really throughout the 21st century, the speakership has really become a very overbearing institution. It's grown just in terms of its staff. We know that's sort of an objective fact, but just the sense that committee chairmen are operating under the speaker and have to sort of work as his limbs rather than as independent power centers is very strong. It was very strong when the speaker was a her as well, maybe even stronger. Pelosi sort of adopted that centralized power model. We've also seen that in the Senate. Historically, the Senate was the more decentralized chamber, but the majority leader of the Senate in the 21st century has really acted a lot like the speaker in many ways, even though the parliamentary realities mean that the tools have to be different, but really the sense that the majority leader is the boss of the agenda in the Senate is the way things have operated in recent years. And it doesn't have to be that way. So yeah, part of my agenda is just helping people realize, the consolidation of agenda control in these centralized leadership offices is a choice that members have made. They've made it for some reasons that we can talk about, but they can make another choice if they're sufficiently frustrated with the way the bodies have operated in recent years.
Yeah, challenge is that on the one side, it seems that extreme decentralization would be the ideal, since it would imply equal representation. If you have highly concentrated power, you don't have equal representation, right? When one person has a lot more power than others, that doesn't seem to be consistent with what the Congress is intended to be. But on the other hand, as you say, it can lead to chaos. And so where is that sweet spot in between?
Yeah, I think if you think of a legislature merely in sort of atomistic terms as composed of each of its members, and somehow they should all just find a way to relate to each other, if that's how you wanted to think of it, well, first of all, 435 members is way too many for that kind of model. The dynamics are just too complicated. So you would need to have a much smaller body. And certainly, you know, if you look at, there's plenty of state senates around the country which have like 50 members or something, right? You can imagine them working in a way much more like that. But for a body as big as the House, you need organization. You know, from the very first Congress, and especially the second Congress, you sort of saw the folks who set up the Constitution operating in Congress and realizing, hey, we need to get some structure here to allow us to have more organized debates, or else things are just going to kind of get away from us. We're going to lose control. So James Madison sort of ends up being the father of political organization in the House after being the father of the Constitution and being very skeptical of parties at the time of the founding. But he comes to think that you needed sort of Republican, you know, little r Republican interests to organize such that they could fight on behalf of the common good in a coordinated manner, rather than just having the moneyed interests come in and sort of boss them around and manipulate things in the Congress. So I think organization really is necessary, and some kind of leadership is necessary. But there's a lot of different models of leadership, right? If you go back to the speakership of Sam Rayburn was a towering figure in Washington. He was very much respected, and sort of a big part of how Congress worked was it ran through Sam Rayburn. But he wasn't actually a boss. He was not just telling everyone the way things are going to be. He was a broker. He was somebody who had a very diverse party. The Democratic Party contained, you know, Southern segregationists and Northern urban liberals, and somehow they had to come together and harmonize their interests and figure out what could bring them together. And Sam Rayburn was sort of very brilliant at making those unlikely combinations work. So we can have a lot of different models of leadership, and we've sort of become addicted to the sort of, well, if we don't have somebody to just decide everything, then we're going to fall to pieces. That's the sort of mentality too often today. And I very much think that that's too much centralization. We can do with a little bit more free play of interest than that.
So you spent a little bit of time on the Hill in the ModCom committee. Can you talk a little bit about your experience there and how that flavored your thinking about Congress as a whole?
Yeah. So in 2019, I got the chance to be a fellow in the House Select Committee for the Modernization of Congress. That was in its first year of operation. It ended up running for 4 years, and it was really fascinating to come to work on the Hill every day, you know, in the Cannon office building, and have a chance to see how the staff work behind the scenes fit in with the members' public activity and private activity. I think it did definitely change my perspective on just how important it is, especially for members, to be able to encounter each other. I think that's one of the things that I feel most strongly about, is that members are politicians. They're often sort of agreeable in disposition by nature, and they kind of want to make deals. Of course, the people who are on the Modernization Committee maybe were especially eager to get along with each other, and I recognize that. But I think there's a sense that if you let politicians get together, they want to make deals with each other. That's kind of what's in their blood. I've learned that some staff on the Hill kind of are afraid of that dynamic to some extent. They don't always want to just see where the members making deals will take them. They want to have sort of a clearer plan of where they want to get to and how they're going to make it happen. And sort of the members can be kind of wild cards in that process. So yeah, I would say that was one of the main things I took away from my time on the Hill, is that really letting members get together is a very powerful force.
And in terms of the changes that ModCom makes, I mean, they've made some iterative changes, and I know that you also think about, fundamental, this pendulum swinging. These are kind of fundamental changes. Did your observation of like how Congress changes over time, when you got in the institution, did you see it happening? Did it feel?
Yeah.
Can you describe that a little bit?
So I think the Modernization Committee was constrained to some extent by the fact that it was this bipartisan committee seeking to operate on a consensus basis, right? So you can only do so much where you're insisting that everyone has to agree. You're not going to get big disruptive changes where you may have some incumbents who are losers from the changes. And yeah, so I thought a lot about sort of to what extent bipartisan reformers, sort of good government types, are are able to be sort of a forceful constituency for change, versus when we think about why this pendulum has swung at different times in congressional history in previous eras, it's not really driven by just a sense that, oh, we wish the institution functioned better. It's really driven by people who have a frustrated agenda, right? If you look at why did the progressive Republicans end up overthrowing Boss Cannon? It was because they wanted to pass a bunch of railroad legislation that they felt that he was totally opposed to, and they had a sense that the Republican orthodoxy was insufficiently aggressive and sort of taking on the corporate interests of the day. And so that meant they were willing to buck their party and join with the Democrats and make something happen. As I've studied congressional reform, I've definitely come to think that the really big shifts in the way the body is going to work have to come from sort of frustrated interests, frustrated agendas, as much as I'd like to be somebody who believes in, I want this institution to operate better and to vindicate its own institutional prerogatives better. And can't we all agree on that as members of Congress? Well, to some extent, yes, but that kind of shared sensibility maybe can only get us so far. If you want the big disruptions, people have to be pretty much drawing those motivations externally, and probably from having roots in the electorate, right? There's sort of congressional reform that's speaking to grassroots needs, and then you can think of sort of congressional reform as a professional enterprise or an institutional enterprise, where really, like, it would be nice to think that the American people are going to get really energized about congressional reform just in and of itself, but I don't really see that as a very realistic vision. It's a little esoteric, unless it's attached to this other sort of agenda policy stuff that they really care more viscerally about.
Yeah, so I'd like to go back to something you mentioned earlier about this concept of, and maybe it was when you were first talking about how what motivated you to get into this area, which was this idea of legitimacy, right? And the idea of good or bad policy, or legitimate or illegitimate policy. Can you talk a little bit about that? What would be a good or bad policy? What would be a legitimate or illegitimate policy?
When I was studying American politics in grad school, one of the things that really drove me up the wall was the reliance on these models where you would have a policy space, right? And maybe it would be one dimensional, maybe it's two dimensional. You have a policy space, and all we're doing when we make policy is moving to a different spot on the policy space. And if it's a one dimensional, you're literally just sort of moving from left to right on this policy lever, and sort of assuming that that's sort of all that matters in the end is where we're ending up on that line. And to me, that's just way too reductive in terms of, well, first of all, you can be trying to do something and you can do it way better or way worse, and it's going to matter a lot whether you're able to put in place a scheme that's amenable to working, or one that's headed toward failure. And second of all, the process of how you get places actually really matters a lot more than I think a lot of the traditional game theoretic modeling would sometimes have you believe. I think how Congress manages to bring different factions into contact with each other, how it manages to make people feel like their concerns are being taken seriously and addressed, even if they're not winning on every single issue they want to, having them feel like they're actually vitally important to the process and to sort of steering the ship of state broadly, that really matters a lot. And so, let me make it more concrete, I think would be helpful. So one issue that I've studied a lot is climate change policymaking. As it happened when I was a research assistant at AEI in the mid-2000s, there was this very important Supreme Court case that came down, Massachusetts versus EPA, in which the Supreme Court more or less told the Environmental Protection Agency that it had to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. And I've been following sort of greenhouse gas emissions regulations pretty closely ever since then. So that's almost 20 years now, I guess. And it's fascinating to me that there's this huge issue confronting our society. We have a sense that we need to be doing a lot of policy stuff to address it. And one of the main levers ought to be regulatory policy, actually just addressing the direct emissions themselves. And yet, Congress has more or less been silent on this issue. And we've had these long-running struggles in the courts and in the Environmental Protection Agency itself, writing different rules, where we tried to hash out some kind of policy system that will serve as a regulatory thing for greenhouse gases. But because Congress has been so uninvolved, that's meant that people who don't like what they come up with in Congress can sort of just snipe at it and say, this is totally illegitimate. You can't try to create a policy this important just by running things through an old statute that was designed for something different. And courts have been very divided on whether what the EPA has done is okay or not. And Congress has mostly dithered institutionally. It hasn't really brought any clarity to this area. And so that's meant that, first of all, the policies that the EPA has tried to pass have been rather unstable. Sort of the main thing that the Obama administration came up with never went into effect. And recently the Supreme Court, after a long while, ruled that it was impermissible. So we've sort of had a lot of legal uncertainty clouding this whole issue. It also just has meant the legislators in Congress have not really forced themselves to take responsibility. That meant that all these different people who are sort of lukewarm about global climate change, they've really never been forced to put their money where their mouths is and say, like, are we willing to do something about this or not? Instead, they just sort of end up as commentators on what's happening in the executive branch. And so that's really frustrating to me. I feel like there actually are majorities in Congress that would be able to settle on pretty reasonable solutions on greenhouse gas emissions if they were given a chance. Maybe that's too optimistic. But they really never forced themselves to even go down that road. And so that leads to this legitimacy problem for climate policy in America. And I think that kind of dynamic plays out in an awful lot of policy areas. Immigration is another one that comes top of mind, where you have a sense that, boy, this is a big problem confronting our country. Something really has to get done. Well, Congress can't be bothered to force itself to come up with some compromise. That means we're going to have these long, drawn-out fights in the executive branch and the courts. And to me, I just don't think that those can ever produce really legitimate policy. They sort of create and contribute to this sense that the American people have, that their government has sort of gotten away from them, and sort of things are happening, but they have no control of them.
So in terms of the two areas you mentioned, climate change and immigration, right? There's two ways you can consider whether Congress is doing anything or not. One is, are they discussing the issue? The other is, are they making any decisions about the issue? And do you see those two things as both failing, or just one of them is failing? Are they just not voting on things, but they're discussing it, or are they not even discussing it? And so the failure is not only in the decision, it's also in the information required to make a decision.
Yeah, so I do think Congress is a legislative body that needs to ultimately be oriented toward passing legislation. And so, if we get deliberation and oversight activity about a topic, but ultimately it's just sitting there and not leading into the legislative process itself and the passage of legislation, I see that as a problem, because I think the need to come together and form broad coalitions that can pass legislation, that's a great sort of disciplining force for legislators to make it so that they have to get off their soapboxes and figure out what's actually in the realm of the possible, right? That's their ultimate responsibility as politicians, is to figure out accommodations. And so to the extent that they're doing a lot of talking and performing of various kinds that aren't flowing into that bargaining dynamic, I find it frustrating. So it's certainly not the case that Congress has not talked about these issues at all. And in a few cases, they certainly made pretty earnest attempts to move things through the legislative process. In my book, I talk about these different things. In immigration, we've in the late Bush 43 administration, there was some pretty serious pushes to do immigration reform. I guess it was the John Boehner era of the House. I think it was 2013. There was a pretty serious push, and I appreciate those efforts. Those were in the right spirit in some ways, and we have to think about why they didn't succeed. Why was that sort of we weren't allowed to go through a lot of different possibilities that might have had the support of broad coalitions. We were never sort of allowed to vote on a whole range of alternatives. In the end, most of those processes kind of petered out because different factions stopped us from being able to consider the full range of alternatives. On climate change, we had a pretty serious push in the early Obama administration for this Waxman-Markey bill that did get through the House eventually, but really never found its legs in the Senate. But that was a serious effort. If you kept having more serious efforts of that sort, my sense is, well, one of them will succeed eventually. We'll figure this out. It does sometimes take multiple iterations for Congress to figure out how to get the stars to align on a really difficult issue. So just trying to pass a bill and failing isn't necessarily a problem, but it's when you sort of have a sense fall over an issue that actually we're just not going to bother to try really anymore because what would be the point? That becomes pretty demoralizing, I think. That's I think where we are today with immigration, right? You have the sense that we have to figure out what it is the Biden administration can make work through all these different administrative measures, and we have a sense that it's like not working all that well in many ways, and some of them are COVID related, and that's kind of awkward when we're all saying the COVID emergency is over, but yet we're like not really saying, well, Congress, this clearly is just something you have to work out, so figure it out. It just seems like people have given up on congressional deliberation and legislation on some of these most important topics, and that's precisely the opposite of what should happen. We should say, man, this is a hard problem. That means we really need Congress to sort it out. We can't just let the executive branch agencies and the courts try to muddle through it.
And do you think this is in part due to that centralization and, ultimately it's leadership's issue, or do you think it's due to the polarization? Do you think it's the fact that Congress already gave up so much power to the other branches that it can hide behind the activities those others can do to sort of alleviate the immediate pain?
All those things sound right to me. When we think about why we have such centralized leadership in the contemporary Congress, I think it comes from this very heightened sense of partisan struggle. I certainly, Francis Lee's idea that people talk so much about of sort of insecure majorities coloring the dynamics of the current era. I certainly agree with that. When you have that mindset, legislators are willing to turn themselves into full-time electioneering professionals, essentially. And there are reasons that if what you're most interested in is representing your party to its best advantage at the next election and putting your opponents in the worst possible light, then having centralized leadership manipulate the agenda in such a way as to present the issues as most favorable to your side and least favorable to the other side makes a lot of sense. So the model we have today performs well at something, and it's there because it performs well at that. I don't want to pretend that it's there for no reason or just by happenstance. It's good at that function. And if you think that the next election is sort of the most important thing in the whole course of American history or world history, then like it just makes sense to think in this way. But my feeling is that there are a lot of folks who are just fatigued with this dynamic and have a sense that both parties are kind of stagnant, that there's a lot of opportunities out there for more dynamic policymaking that have been foregone. because of the need to sort of fall back into partisan trenches on everything. So my sense is that there are some sort of interesting, strange bedfellows coalitions that could coordinate, or just like a large vital center on some of these topics. Certainly immigration, I firmly believe there really are just like a lot of people in the center of American politics who would like to fix some obvious problems and could easily get behind a sensible package that did more on border security and did more on figuring out how to help people who find themselves in legal limbo. And I think there's just like there's deals out there to be made on a lot of stuff. And the leadership often thinks, well, if making deals on this kind of stuff means going down an uncertain path where we have to assemble a weird bipartisan coalition to get across the finish line, I'm just not that interested, because that scrambles my narrative for the next election. And I'm happier to just keep things on narrowly sort of partisan talking points line. Now we've actually, the 117th Congress, I would say, had some positive notes on this front. Like there were some areas where we were able to let the bipartisan coalition making happen, right? We saw that on infrastructure. We saw this on the CHIPS Act, even on gun control. We got a modest bill through this way. So that was heartening to me. There were some good steps in that direction, but I kind of want to see a lot more of it.
So that also brings up this concept that, if the parties are putting themselves above the will of the Congress as a whole, right? That's what the whole Hastert rule is all about in part, I think. That they've elevated party concerns above Congress concerns. Congress's institutional power, right, is then threatened. It's hard, and I know you've talked about this, or you have some thoughts about this issue. Congress acting in its own interest, especially vis-a-vis the other branches. How does that play into that dynamic? Can Congress really act on its own behalf as a unit compared to the other branches, or in general, when you've got these leaders who are ultra focused on party concerns rather than the branch's concerns?
I think some historical perspective here is helpful again. I mean, when you go back to the late 70s, there was this interesting moment where you had Congress fighting the executive branch, quite a bit of bipartisan unity in at least some of these fronts, one of which was the legislative veto, which was a really interesting, important thing that eventually got knocked out. But you had part of like creating the House Counsel's Office, a lawyer for the House as an institution was bound up in that fight to vindicate the institutional prerogatives of Congress in this struggle with the executive branch. And that there was a sense that transcended party, that was not just about any kind of partisan advantage. I think it has gotten harder and harder for anybody to adopt that frame of mind in recent years. I think if you ask Nancy Pelosi to think about what her legacy is, she will basically give you answers. She was a great leader of the Democratic Party and showed an amazing ability to hold Democrats together and get them to pull together and do some great things as a party. That's what she would say. She wouldn't really be talking about Congress as a whole. She was not a sort of congressional institutionalist in that way. She has a lot of claims to greatness on that other front, I would say. But I would just say our leaders in recent years have not mostly been that interested. I think appropriations is an interesting subculture of Congress, where I think there is still more bipartisan comedy there, and there is still more of a sense of the need to protect congressional prerogatives against executive encroachment. This sort of need to keep the power of the purse relevant, I think, is something you can get members of both parties excited about. I mean, you can see some cross-partisan activity on this front and related to war powers, right? There's a debate happening as we talk today about whether we can finally repeal these authorizations for the use of military force from 20 years ago, relating to the Iraq War and the kind of people who are excited about that and sort of getting Congress to, reassert its authority over these issues and take it back from the executive branch. That's an interesting bipartisan coalition of people. There are sort of niches on Capitol Hill where people still do think in these terms. And I think there's certainly just, Madison thought that we wanted ambition to counteract ambition. And to the extent that you can get legislators to be really ambitious for what they want their branch to be able to do in setting the course for American government, that should naturally lead them to assert the place's institutional interests as opposed to the executive branch, as opposed to the courts. So there are those underlying constitutional dynamics that should push us in that direction, but they've been submerged to the partisan ones in recent years. So I guess, when I think about what's going to change that, I often do think about sort of to what extent it requires coming in conjunction with some kind of political realignment where people start to say, well, hey, I'm just not that enthusiastic about helping my party right now compared to this set of policy objectives that I think are really urgent and pressing. And I think, Trump certainly scrambled a lot of things in terms of the partisan landscape in American politics. We still see that very much working itself out today. Sort of interesting factional activity in Congress right now. So I think the raw materials for sort of less thinking about partisan advantage, more thinking about, hey, what is it that we can get this institution to be doing for the American people? I think that stuff is happening. Whether it can triumph, I think there's an awful lot of things sort of keeping the partisan dynamics top of mind also. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah. So I guess that, the 118th, you've kind of given us a little bit of your opinion there. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on where you think the pendulum is swinging and whether the speaker, election was a sign of things to come. And then also maybe can you talk about, circling back to your book about the future, where do you think it's all going? I know you have in your book, you talk about 2039 and different scenarios for Congress. Can you talk us through where we are now and where do you think the paths are to lead us to 2039? Like, where are we going to end up?
So, yeah, I think the pendulum is already swinging in the House, especially. I think the speakership fight, which, we hadn't had one on the floor like that in 100 years. I think some people were inclined to view that as just sort of a random, strange thing because of a few stubborn people on the Republican side. And certainly there are some members of the House that answer that description. And we're part of the story as that speakership struggle played out in January. But I thought it was really important to listen to what this larger block of Republican holdouts was saying about what they wanted to see changed in the institution. A lot of what they were saying was music to my ears in terms of wanting the speaker to be a less dominant figure, wanting there to be more room for factional interplay, wanting there to be even actually interesting things happening on the floor of the House, right? Not just committees, but even members being able to offer amendments on the floor. That was important to them. That's something that just hasn't been happening much in recent years with the extent to which we've relied on heavily structured and closed rules. And this faction of members of whom I would say Chip Roy of Texas sort of seemed like the most articulate member and sort of the leader in negotiating with McCarthy and his allies. They had a vision of Congress operating in a more decentralized manner, and they got themselves some seats on the Rules Committee out of this fight, and they got themselves some other rules changes. And I think there's some reasons to hope that that fight did sort of presage a Congress that works in a somewhat less top-down fashion. It's really still too early to tell, and it's a little bit frustrating because at the same time, I think the expectations for the 118th Congress are incredibly low. I think a lot of people, when they think about the 118th Congress, they think, well, we sure hope they figure out something on the debt ceiling so they don't blow up the world economy. And we hope they manage to pass some spending bills so that the government doesn't shut down. Other than that, we're really not expecting the Democrats in the Senate and the Republicans in the House to agree on a whole lot. I don't know, what do people talk about? FAA reauthorization or something. Not a lot of stuff that sets the world on fire. So I think if you're willing to just sort of live with a Congress that just doesn't do much, to some extent, all this struggling over centralized power or not centralized power, it comes to seem a little bit academic. Like if this stuff is really to have stakes, it has to be because you're making that push to do something more interesting. There's still plenty of time. We're just a few months in to a 2-year session. We'll see what they make of it. But I think getting to my book's 3 scenarios. So the last 3 chapters of my book, they have these little counterfactual hypothetical histories written from observers in 2039, which will be the 250th anniversary of Congress. And so you have these observers sort of giving little reflections on how the institution is doing at 250, which is a helpful frame of mind, I think, thinking about where the different reform impulses can go. So the three scenarios are entitled decrepitude, rubber stamp, and revival. Decrepitude really just requires sort of more of the same, a sort of sense that keeping the lights on gets harder and harder because so much is difficult to get through Congress. We find more and more workarounds of doing things in the executive branch without Congress's approval. It's both very bleak and very plausible because it doesn't really require a lot of new developments. That's the decrepitude scenario that I think I hope people sort of take as a gut check of how important it is to arrest some of the trends that we have in the institution today. The rubber stamp chapter sort of takes this notion of congressional reform that I talked about in the opening here, where like basically Congress is not working well. We need to reform it by making it get out of the way more, right? So I think about some constitutional reforms that would go through that would empower the president vis-a-vis Congress, basically by giving the president the ability to force Congress to take votes on his favored legislation, and think about what that would mean for American democracy if Congress were to basically become a rubber stamping body, which sort of offered its legitimacy to legislation as a matter of formal practice, but really wasn't contributing all that much substantively. So yeah, that was a really fascinating one for me to think through. I did some reading about what functions legislatures play in authoritarian countries where everybody really understands that they're not really important policy-making bodies. But it's kind of fascinating that almost every country in the world has a functioning legislature, right? They're all bringing together these legislators to do stuff, even if from the outside we would understand them as dictatorships. The members of Congress still find things to do. I think just sort of pure representative blowing off steam, just sort of saying, I'm your voice. I can give voice to your frustrations. There are ways that Congress can embrace that function. And I think it's a healthy function. It's not a bad thing in and of itself. But if that becomes the whole point of the place, I think it gets back to the sense that we lose the sense that what comes out of the federal government is really the choices of the American people. And I think there would be a big danger if Congress recedes to this rubber stamp role that a large part of the population at least just comes to think of the federal government as this sort of alien oppressive body. Yeah, arguably you already have too many people thinking that way today. It's obviously a very dangerous trend. If you really believe that in your bones, some really extreme things start to make sense. So we want to avoid that. So we really want Congress to become a more vital place where it's not just able to represent people in the sense of blowing off steam, but it's able to represent different interests in American life, different kinds of people in our very diverse country, and bring them together and force them to accommodate each other. That's really the key of my vision for the American Constitution and Congress's place in it. If we come to think of segments of our population as backward and like we'd be better off just ignoring what they have to say, then obviously starts to make sense to make their voices in Congress mean less. But in my view, we really can't afford to do that. We will be risking something truly existential about what it is to be a democracy if we just try to shut people out of debate because they seem so inconvenient to work with. And Congress is the place where really we have to find a way to work with them.
So in your story of the future, how did you get to the revitalized Congress version? What were the key steps
So
taken to make it happen?
that's the hardest one to write. It goes back to this insight that I talked about earlier, where to get the really sort of tectonic shift in the organization of Congress, you need some overriding interest that sort of barrels through the existing partisan arrangements and has a sense that just sort of existing arrangements need so much disruption. So the way I do it in the book is I come up with a scenario in which our immigration crisis gets sort of an order of magnitude worse. There's sort of a natural disaster in Central America that causes a lot more people to be seeking to move northward into the country. And then there's like the other mechanism is a Chinese crackdown on Christians that leads to a lot of Chinese Christians trying to get into this country, which I think would be an interesting political wrinkle on the immigration question. And basically, the overriding importance of this immigration question in this scenario kind of fractures both of the parties internally to themselves and creates this room for maneuvering. And actually, I have a speakership fight play out, which is something I wrote well before the events of January. And basically, you have a surprise speakership election where you have a bipartisan coalition of members coming together to elect a speaker who was not the sort of orthodox partisan choice of the elected partisan majority. And the new speaker, I have a freshman member elected speaker, which is something we've had twice in American history. Henry Clay was elected speaker on his arriving in the House, and we had this sort of disastrous speakership fight in 1859, which led to a freshman member, the former governor of New Jersey, being elected speaker. So a freshman speaker comes in sort of promising to make politics happen differently around immigration, and sort of having a big fight. Basically, that's the idea, is that the speaker promises to let us fight it out and vote on a lot of different alternatives. And we find that we're able to sort of come up with some creative and interesting compromises that didn't seem available before because of having allowed this fight to play out in the halls of Congress. So that's my, do I think any of that is particularly likely in its particulars? No, I guess not. Immigration seems almost stultifyingly partisan today, unfortunately. I think the idea is that you get some big issue possibly induced by a crisis that causes people to think of something more important than sticking to their party lines, and willing to scramble the way things are working in each of the two chambers, and have that really revitalize the idea of actually fighting things out in Congress and seeing where that takes you. I think that's the thing about Congress. Really ought to be an exciting place. It's a place of possibility. It's a place where it isn't just a matter of reading what was in the party platform and seeing how we can get the votes to deliver that. It's a place where lots of people have lots of different objectives, and you mix them all together and you don't know what comes out at the other end. And you actually need people with legislative skill and sort of artists of the possible, right? People who are good at figuring out how to work with people that they don't agree with on most things, and seeing what kind of deals they can make happen. And that's my sort of vision of a revitalized Congress, is a place that's actually really a more interesting, where legislators are more important because they're guiding these accommodations where no one really knows how they're going to go. I think that vision appeals to members. Members are frustrated if you tell them that what they really are is vote pushers and telemarketers who raise money for their party and vote as their leadership tells them to. If that's all the job is, it's not particularly dignified work. It's like not really that important who sits in the seats, except to say who's better at doing the fundraising. Like, legislators ought to have a bigger vision of what Congress is all about in our constitutional system than that. they ought to realize that it's up to them to actually represent the American people and do so in a way that's sort of animated by a sense of possibility and a sense that we as Americans have a future that we work out together.
Excellent. Well, I think it's time for us to move on to our common questions, ask everybody so we can compare the answers. So you ready for the next phase?
Sure.
First question is, related to what you're talking about, but back to the fundamentals of representation. What should representation actually mean to these members? Who are their constituents? Is it their primary voters? Is it everybody in the district? Is somewhere in between? Is it future generations? And then how should they represent them? Are they just reflecting their beliefs? Are they judging in their best interest as they see it? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, so those are really deep, fun questions that I feel like we could talk about for many hours themselves. I wanted to read you this quotation on this one that I really love. It's from this political theorist Hannah Pitkin, who wrote one of the sort of seminal works on representation, not just legislative representation, but the idea more generally. And the line that I have quoted in my book is, "Representatives should be articulate rather than just typical." I really love that line. What does it mean to be representative? There's sort of this descriptive representation notion that we kind of want the members of Congress to look like the population at large, sort of be drawn from the right demographic categories and reflect the people in that way, in a sort of visual mirror-like way. To me, that's has some importance, but it's not really what representation is all about. Representation is like a little bit mystical of a concept, right? The idea that you sort of make present something that isn't present. It has to work because people believe in it. There's something sort of fictional about the way it works, but people have to believe that it's a meaningful fiction. And so I do think one of the most important things we can do is think about what makes that connection between representatives and their constituents vital. And I'm worried that the replacement of all other forms of connection other than partisan connection have been eroding in recent years. Right? This idea that Tip O'Neill, famously said, "All politics are local," and that was the lesson that he took from his political education in Boston, and in national politics. But it's unfortunately like a lot less clear that that's true today. That we have sort of locally rooted politics at the bottom of everything. I'm concerned about the way representation is mediated only through these very ideological or almost animus-driven national parties today, right? It's almost easier for people to just try to define themselves by what they dislike and forge a connection with some of their voters because of those mutual dislikes. That's not a very healthy basis. I do think, again, I think when you actually mix it up with the politicians who manage to get themselves elected to Congress, they have a lot of good instincts. They want to feel representational of their communities in really a deeper sense than that. And a lot of them manage it. But yeah, I'm very attached to the geographic model of representation. I think that even as members of the House have come to represent, larger population districts, I still think that geographic rootedness is very important. I know there are a lot of reformers who think sort of geography is obsolete. We'd be better off moving to some kind of not geography-based proportional representation system. I'm torn about that. I think I see some advantages in doing that, but I fundamentally think that geographically coherent communities that feel themselves as organic units and then feel that they have organic interests that their representatives in Congress can articulate for them. I think that is a viable model even in the 21st century. So that's how I think about representation. I do think it needs some work.
And so it sounds like you agree with this concept that a member represents their whole district from a geographic point of view. So all the people in there. It sounds like that's what you're implying.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously tough to say every single person, right, is going to be well represented by their representative. It kind of just it kind of seems like that must not be true as a matter of math, right? Right, there must be some people whose views are sufficiently marginal that they're really just not going to get represented very well. And I don't see that as itself sort of a crisis of democracy. I think that's just the way things work. But I do think there's a sense that, yeah, I mean, regions have interests. I think that they're often rooted in, local geography and economy, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm very much against sort of wanting to say, oh, members of Congress have parochial interests and therefore they can never look out for the national good. That's something that sort of boosters of the presidency sometimes say to detract from Congress and say why we should let the president decide everything anyway, because he's the sort of whole country's representative. I don't buy that at all. I think it's really important not to simplify out all the difference in our extended republic that we have, and to try to allow us to understand it as legitimate. If you're from tobacco country and you want to represent the tobacco industry, that's not because you're corrupt. That's because that's part of the interests of your district. So I think the sense that everything is a special interest that needs to be suppressed. I don't go for that. I want members to be representing the economic interests of their district. I think that's very much salutary.
Great. So next question is about Congress's time. How would you allocate it? Should they spend all their time in that geography? Should they be in DC? Should they be spending their time dialing for dollars? How should should they be? What's your recommendation on how should they be spending their time?
Right. Yeah, the dialing for dollars thing as a time suck is a huge concern for me. I think if members really do have to spend all their time fundraising, that's a disaster for the institution. And so I would be very enthusiastic about money and politics reforms that are specifically geared for the time suck part of it. To say, if somehow the House could create rules for its members that they were not allowed to spend more than a certain portion of their time fundraising. First of all, I would imagine that the members would be thrilled about that, most of them anyway, and that would be very healthy, because that would allow them to actually be thinking about the substance of policy issues and to be encountering their colleagues in fruitful ways that allow them to think about what are the possibilities for legislating. So yeah, I think members are very much spread too thin today, and I wish they would spend more time in Washington myself. I think you have to have a strong sense of trust that your representative really is going to represent the region's interests. But I think the way to make the system work is to have that trust and then to send them into the belly of the beast, as it were, and figure out how to make things work in Washington. I think there are some people who have a more delegate model of what representation is all about, that they need to stay close to their constituents all the time. Maybe it would even be better if they could vote from their district. Just phone it in, right? Or use a smartphone app or whatever. It's not like that would be technologically so hard to pull off. I don't buy it. I think actually being in the room together with their colleagues is very important. Congress is what we call the place. It's about congressing. It's about bringing people together such that they can work things out. And I think that needs to happen in physical space. So that's part of what my model of representation is all about. I think the reform idea that people should stay closer to their constituents and not be tainted by Washington. I think has a very unhealthy sense of what the legislative process really needs to entail.
So, related to that is this notion of debate, deliberation, dialogue, right? And doing that in person. So what's your opinion on how that should happen? Should it be in the committees? Should it be on the floor? Should it be in the bar? Should it be transparent or should it be private? When all this is
Yeah, I think deliberation can happen in a lot of different channels at once. And I certainly am not someone who thinks that like all of the important action needs to play out somehow on the floor of the chambers, and we need to have grand debates on the floor of the chambers that somehow settle everything. That doesn't seem very realistic. I would like to see more meaningful debates on the chamber floors that bring some topics alive for the American people. I think that too often legislators today don't care about the art of public speaking on the floor of their chambers at all. I think, gosh, I think members should be embarrassed to read a speech that their staffer wrote on the floor of the chamber. That just seems awful. They should be able to speak with feeling on these issues on the floor of the House and engage their colleagues more directly. Uh, that would be to the good if we could get members to do that more. But I do think a lot of the kind of encountering that I've been talking about has to happen in a non-public way. For people to speak candidly to each other, to be able to do the kind of frank horse trading that is sometimes necessary, it just can't all play out in front of the cameras. So I think we have probably too much transparency on Capitol Hill today. I wish that the members had more chances to speak to each other in private. I think it would be great if more committees could have non-public hearings where they would actually really be seeking to educate themselves instead of putting on performances for public consumption. I think that would be really healthy for the institution as a place that knows that it needs to learn lots of things from experts. Like, gosh, members should be able to show ignorance. Like, we have all these people who like to laugh about it whenever members ask ignorant questions of their witnesses, right? That shouldn't be embarrassing at all. Members have to know about so many things. They come from so many different backgrounds. They ought to be able to be ignorant and actually inform themselves and make mistakes in asking questions of people who really know the answers. But public hearings are not always the best way to make that happen, especially high profile public hearings. It would be good if Congress could find more ways of carving out private spaces for its members. Bipartisan private spaces are really important. Those are very scarce today. We would do well to have more of them. So I think, yeah, I mean, I think deliberation to some extent in the internet age is going to happen like on the internet. People's sort of surrogates mixing it up on the internet is one way deliberation happens. But the thing to remember is that the members of Congress, if we can make them legislate, they're the ones who feel a sense of responsibility in the end, who have to not just blow off steam, and who have to not just talk past each other, but figure out ways of speaking to each other and persuading their colleagues. That's a really healthy disciplining mechanism compared to the kind of deliberation that can go on the internet, where sort of sometimes the most toxic voices who are least interested in any kind of accommodation and most interested in making the other side look bad are the ones that rise to the top of the algorithm.
The next question is, what fundamental institutional change should Congress make within 50 years?
Boy, 50 years is a long time, and it's hard to know how the world is going to change by then. But I do think that when you think on those timescales, you do want to, like, Congress does seem like a body that needs to build up its capacities on some levels, that needs to be able to use cutting edge technology to make its research and deliberation more effective. And so I do think there's a lot that Congress can do on that front because it's starting from a pretty low baseline. And of course, technological change is going to be coming at us pretty fast in years to come, I suspect. So when you think on that time frame, I do think some of the tools that are going to make inquiry more possible should be especially attractive to generalists, right? The generalists in Congress who need to figure out ways on drawing on all the specialized knowledge out there in the world in intelligent ways. And yeah, I do think that some of the sort of tech possibilities on that frontier seem exciting to me, and I hope that Congress will have the foresight to invest in them. I think that where Congress has managed to build, nonpartisan technical assets within its own four walls, those are just tremendously valuable to the institution. So I'm a huge admirer of the Congressional Budget Office and the Congressional Research Service. Congress should do more building out of institutions like that its members can really trust to be helpers in the work of legislating, because they need a lot of help.
Right, next question is, what book or article most shaped your thinking with respect to congressional reform?
I think the one that I come back to a lot is James Sundquist's book, Rise and the Decline and Resurgence of Congress, I believe is his name. So that was written at a particular moment, I think published 1980, sort of at the tail end of this decade of extraordinary activity in reinventing what Congress was all about in the 1970s. And Sundquist is kind of a pessimist on the long-term future of Congress, actually. He thinks that the executive branch has some inherent advantages over Congress that are ultimately going to be very difficult for the legislature to overcome. I think he's a little too pessimistic, but he does an amazing job of painting a picture of how this institution came back to life. That's what makes the 1970s very exciting decade to study for me, is that just the members of Congress were filled with a sense of possibility, and they were not afraid to do big things to reinvent the way that Congress worked. I think that they didn't always make the right choices in how they were reinventing things, but just that sense of possibility is really quite inspiring. And I think members today would do well to learn from it. And Sundquist does a good job of capturing sort of what they were able to set in motion, what he was optimistic about in what they had started, and what he was a little worried about also. But it's a tremendous book for anyone wanting to get a little zoomed back from the current moment and to think about some of the long-term challenges of a legislature in a modern society. I think it's just a tremendous book.
Last question is really around your future plans in terms of research and focus, and what do we have on the horizon?
Yeah, so I'm certainly keenly observing what's happening in the current Congress in terms of organizational changes. I'm really fascinated to see what's happening in the Rules Committee now that we have these Republican insurgents who have gotten themselves seats and could potentially ally with the 4 Democrats on the committee to vote against their sort of Orthodox Party members. That there's all sorts of ripe possibilities there. So I'm going to be watching that a lot and very closely. I think trying to outline the vision of what a more decentralized but not chaotic Congress can look like today is part of what I feel like I need to do better. To say what it would mean for committees to have more agenda power, how we could set some things down in the rules that would ensure that, how we could do some things to make committee chairmanships somewhat more secure without necessarily going all the way back to the principle of seniority is sacrosanct, which I don't necessarily think anyone's so interested in today. Yeah, trying to flesh out that vision of a somewhat more decentralized Congress, and this what it looks like for this more vital interplay of interests to be going on. I think we need some people trying to present vivid illustrations of the possibilities of that for the would-be reformers among the membership. So that's my agenda today. Trying to get the word out about the messages of my book. Yeah, gosh. Meanwhile, I'm just really convinced that figuring out how to use GPT-4 to somehow do research on Congress is really important to my future as a gainfully employed person. So I'm thinking a little about what I can do on that front. I haven't come up with anything too groundbreaking yet, or not that I'm willing to disclose publicly. So we'll see where that takes us. But I think it's an exciting time to be thinking about Congress right now. I think you have an awful lot of frustrations with the dynamics of American politics of the last few years from all different directions. I think you have a lot of people who feel like Congress ought to be a more interesting place than it has been, and so I think there is a moment where reformers have a chance to break through, and so I want to be a part of helping that happen. So that's my agenda in the near term.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Wallach, thank you so much for the time. It's been a pleasure, and best of luck with the book and the coming research.
All right, thank you. It's been a privilege being part of such a distinguished group of interviewers for this series. So I really thank you for that.
Thank you.